adjust my camera here. By the way, the minutes say, or excuse me, the agenda says that the minutes are kept audio recording. Is it only an audio recording or is there a video recording as well?
It is a video as well.
Okay. So this is Val Humble calling the board meeting of Peninsula 2 Drainage District to order. Val Humble present. Leslie, are you here?
Leslie Sawyer present.
And Kathy?
Kathy Killen present.
That constitutes a quorum. We therefore are in order. As the minutes of this meeting are being kept by video recording. Is there any public testimony?
There is no public testimony.
The agenda mentions contract approvals and says there are none. Does that mean that's just a standard entry and we don't have anything under that?
Correct.
Heading?
That's correct.
So I guess we're at the item D on the agenda, the 13th Avenue pump station discharge lines.
Can I share my screen, Emily?
Yes, I think I gave you.
All right. Good morning.
Good morning.
So I'm here this morning to talk about the 13th Avenue pump station discharge line rehab project. So the goal today is to just give you guys an update. I know it's been several months. This will be informational only, so there's no action required today from the board. So the intent of this project remains the same, which is to extend the useful life of these lines for about 10 years. However, the scope has evolved over the last few months given the extent of the scour discovered at the levee toe in the fall. MCD staff have been working really hard to address this expanded scope while keeping costs as low as possible. We've also confirmed with regulatory agencies that environmental mitigations will be required through the permitting process to complete this project. Due to these changes, we're confident that we will need additional funds for this project exceeding what was planned in the CIP, and we'll update the board in the coming months once we have those construction cost estimates. So just to give a quick refresher on the project, we last talked to the board in January of this year. The discharge lines at 13th Ave are no longer structurally supported by the levee. The slope here has eroded into the slough beneath the pipes and well into the bottom of the bank. Additionally, the pipe coating has worn away and needs to be replaced. So again, the purpose of this project is to extend the useful life of these pipes by about 10 years until we can fully replace them, which is slated for around 2026 to 2028. So what needs to be done right now is we need to stabilize the levee slope that has eroded into the slough to prevent the pipes from failing, as well as to maintain the levee. We currently have parametrics under contract to complete the design, and we've completed up to the first task order with them, which included 30% design. So the current planned budget for this project for this fiscal year is $416,000. So again, the critical need here is to stabilize the levee slope that has eroded into the slough. We performed some bathymetry in the fall that revealed significant scour occurring at the outfall, which prompted additional design considerations. Since then, we've been able to conclude that the levee erosion is exacerbated by the scour at the outfall itself. This graphic is showing a comparison between the levee profile from 1982 record drawings when the pipes were built and the October 2020 survey. So this shaded part is showing an aerial view of the levee. These are the two discharge lines. The outfall is here. And it's showing, this color scale is showing that these dark orange and red colors are identifying a loss between 3 to 6 feet in surface elevation on the levee. So this is another view of the loss of ground on the levee. This is a cross section. So this green line is again the 1980 record drawings, and the dotted line here is the surveyed ground from the fall. This dotted line is the ordinary high water line. So to stabilize the slope, we need to add fill in this red circled area or riprap to successfully stabilize the pipes. And doing work in this area under the ordinary high water line is what's triggering environmental permits that will require mitigations related to water quality and habitat impacts. So here is just a close-up view of that area. So you can see how much ground we have lost right here. The scale is 20 feet. So there's no way to successfully stabilize these pipes without placing fill below the ordinary high water line. Right now, this is what we have called a localized failure at the levee toe, and general slope stability analyses suggest that a localized failure can turn into a global failure with a slump all the way to the crest if this isn't repaired, and that's what I have pictured here in the bottom right. This is a photo also from the fall survey work. So you can just see the ground loss under the pipes here, and you can see the deflection point on the right line. Over the last few years, MCD operations staff have noted a visual increase in slope erosion every winter, meaning that we're positive that this scour hole is not stable and the erosion continues to worsen after every rainy season. And then I'm going to pass it over to Carrie Sandeman to talk about our permitting coordination.
Yeah, thanks, McKenna. So Carrie Sandeman, I'm the Environmental Program Manager. In January, we anticipated that the project would trigger multiple environmental permits. And so I just want to take a minute to give you a summary of what those are and why they are, since McKenna's going to talk a bit more about how they affect design. So let's see, primarily we're thinking about two things here, which is impacts to water quality and impacts to habitat. And since we spoke with you in the winter, we have essentially double and triple checked our assessment of which permits are going to be required and how they're going to affect the project through both coordinating with a number of regulatory agencies and also an independent analysis of the regulatory requirements. The trigger, as McKenna mentioned, is placing material below the ordinary high water mark. That brings in the Army Corps of Engineers and Department of State Lands permitting. And in addition to their concerns, they consult with Oregon Department of Environmental Quality for water quality issues and with NOAA Fisheries on endangered species habitat. For water quality, the main issue is the suspension of sediment that you can see in this photo when the pipes are running. So the force of water coming out of the outfalls has been suspending material from the slough floor that's eroding the levee toe and destabilizing the outfall, but also acts as a pollutant in the slough system. So turbidity and suspended solids can make it harder for plants to grow. They help water help. They unfortunately have water heat up faster, which can be detrimental for many aquatic species. And they cause stress and reduce survival in salmonids, some of which are endangered or threatened. So that's why both DEQ and NOAA Fisheries cannot approve our permit application unless we can address this ongoing activity of erosion and scour that's suspending sediment into the water column. And then for habitat, the issue is primarily the habitat function of the type of fill that we use. So if we use rock, riprap, and if that is exposed, then we will most likely, or we will almost certainly have to mitigate for the impacts to habitat that creates. So DSL, Department of State Lands, will only approve our permit if we can show that we have basically made the system whole in terms of habitat function. And NOAA Fishery fisheries can only approve our permit if if they can assess that we are not adversely affecting endangered salmonids. So banks reinforced with rock provide fewer habitat benefits to our native species than a vegetated slope. And certainly the design is going to look for opportunities to reduce the amount of exposed rock and therefore reduce our mitigation requirements and the impacts that this project has for habitat. But whatever rock is remained is something that we will need to mitigate for because of Department of State lands and NOAA fisheries permitting programs. So yes, to summarize, agency consultation, independent review, we will need to address both the water quality impacts associated with the scour and any habitat impacts for exposed rock, depending on how the end design comes together. Yeah, back to you, McKenna.
So given these new considerations, some of the components that we're looking at for design include this flow spreader for energy dissipation. So this will limit the erosion by slowing the force of the water being discharged. You can kind of think of this as a shower head versus a faucet. So it's it has a bunch of smaller holes instead of one large hole. And this is going to be our most cost-effective option to meet the regulatory requirements. Important thing to note here is that this is going to be necessary for permitting water quality impacts, but it is also necessary for a successful engineering design because it will increase the effectiveness of the riprap we're placing by adding that additional erosion protection. This is actually not the first time we've used one of these. We have these at 2 pump stations that we manage. We actually have one at Schmear Pump Station, and we also have one at Sandy Pump Station in SDIC. So these were installed in the early 2000s, and they've been successful since then. So the other new design addition is that we'll need to replace this discharge structure here, which is right now these wooden piles that kind of cradle the outfall of the pipe to stabilize it. This will need to be replaced to accommodate the extra weight, extra load of this new fitting. So I also wanted to point out that this will need to be replaced anyway before feasibility study projects commence because the Corps does not plan to do any work below ordinary high water. So it is a good time to kind of include this now and replace it. Yeah, so just to summarize again, the scope of this project has evolved a lot since the creation of this project in the CIP. After our bathymetry findings in the fall, we've also had clarity, as Carrie mentioned, that environmental mitigations will be required during our permitting process, including those for water quality and habitat. We are still working on refining our options for habitat mitigation, and we're working on finding the most cost-effective ways to include that in our design. So MCDD staff is working really hard to reduce these costs for Pen 2 as much as possible. When the original CIP budget was created, we did not anticipate work occurring below ordinary high water, but we know now that that is going to be necessary. So given all that, the project budget will need to increase to complete construction, but we don't have updated cost estimates at this time, but I plan to update the board in a few months once we have a better idea on that. So that is all I have. Are there any questions, comments?
So it sounds like we've got some serious project budget creep. The mitigation of the improvement of the environment by getting rid of the stirring up the mud, that doesn't count in our favor when it comes to the fact that we need to have riprap to keep it from happening in the future. They're going to say riprap is bad, even though there might not be any other way to prevent the mud being stirred up.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Carrie, if you want to.
Yeah, well, so there's two, I would say overall there are 3 agencies and sort of 2 on each side of things, again, because they're thinking both about water quality and also about habitat. So the water quality degradation associated with the erosion and sediment is to some extent considered separately by some agencies like Oregon DEQ than the habitat impact, negative impact of placing rock, which is also a concern kind of in addition, aside from the water quality impacts to NOAA fisheries. So you're correct. We cannot necessarily trade one for the other.
There are two separate impacts that the agencies are asking us to address as we repair and stabilize the levee to ensure it doesn't fail from that scour.
Is there an option to cover the rock with soil and grass, or would that erode?
That's something that we're definitely looking into. There's constructability issues when we're talking about below the water line, but it's certainly something that, as I mentioned, trying to reduce the area of exposed rock and therefore reduce the impacts through the design. Sorry, McKenna, I probably should have let you respond to that one.
No, that's good.
And Kevin, I don't know whether you want to address this, but I'm impressed with our team. They're really pressing our contractor to look for alternatives, and we're I think on the edge of potentially finding a new way that will still require some riprap, but should help minimize the amount of mitigation that's required. But I've just seen them really pushing on our contractor hard to find ways to stabilize the levee and make our system safe while minimizing these impacts to the budget.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, we're trying to move it down a road that wouldn't require dewatering, which would be, which is what McKenna noted here towards the end of her presentation. And then also to find a design that is considered self-mitigating, which speaks to sort of what Val was suggesting, is that within the riprap, we would have some environmental mitigations, either soil and plantings and things like that we could get approved, potentially by the Corps of Engineers as well. And that way, what we need to implement at the site counts as the mitigation that we need to do environmentally for the work that we're doing below ordinary high water. Anyway, so I feel like it's headed down a good road, but we just don't have enough resolution yet to present additional costs or guarantees on what the design is going to be yet.
And honestly, the agencies can't really tell us that until they see our final designs, because they can't fully assess the potential impacts. So we're in that negotiation phase, and we got really clear direction from you back in January, and we're going to continue to follow that direction as we finalize the design and move into permitting.
Thank you. That does relieve some of my heartburn. How about other directors? Do you have any comments? Oh, I should note, for the purpose of the minutes, that Mary Helen Kincaid joined us shortly into the presentation.
She did, and she has questions. It wouldn't be fair unless I did. I think you're doing a great job in investigating this. My question in dealing with other agency, I don't know how to say this correctly, but it's sort of like but we includes DEQ, NOAA, probably BES is in there somewhere commenting, permitting. And if they're going to tell us what to do, and I understand the permitting process is, to me, backwards, but they're going to tell us we need to do these things, but offer no funding assistance. And so it's not clear to me, well, what I understand, so correct me if I'm wrong, and I think Carrie just answered this, DEQ, there's water quality, NOAA, habitat. I'm guessing Audubon will jump in at some point and have comments. So why wouldn't we ask those people to assist with financial improvements?
I can jump in. The federal and state agencies are in a regulatory role at this point. So we're actually, from their perspective, our operations are degrading the environment. And so they're not going to give us money to do that. We're really on our own. It's part of our O&M. And there is a permitting process that does allow some public access, but ultimately it's up to the regulatory agency staffs themselves to make those determinations. I think where there is money is if we're moving into a direct restoration project, or we're doing some other things that are, I guess what I would say is more proactively and environmentally focused, as opposed to maintaining our operations. And Carrie or Kevin or somebody, if you want to jump in, it's really not the type of thing they fund, because we've created this impact through our operations. They expect us to obey the law and really do our part to restore the function of the system while maintaining our operations.
So technically, who, and I don't know the correct terminology, owns the slough? I understand where the drainage districts have pipes that are pumping into it, but so the regulatory agencies have the responsibility for, if it maintaining is not the word, but I guess I'm going to, in any project, and this one's far from this, but if we did nothing, the pipes broke and the water went in there anyway, would there be penalties, or does DQ and the other regulatory agencies come and say your pipes are going to cause problems down the road and fix them?
I mean, I think the larger impact, and Kevin, please jump in, would be that there would be flooding on the other side of the levee.
Okay.
Yeah, to address that, Mary Helen, we do have agreements with them, and we've done work before that way in other districts, where basically we had an emergency, and we've had to work on things. And effectively what you fall under when you do work that way is an agreement with DSL that, yeah, you can do this work, but you're going to have to make it right with us later. So, they're still going to hold you to the same standard, except now you're even in a worse position because you're not coming to an agreement on what that is before you start that work. You basically just have to appease them after the fact.
Okay. I mean, my sole purpose is trying to find somebody else to help pay for part of it. So, and any way that I, as a board supervisor, can help advocate for that, because we got DEQ to remove invasive species from the park and the wetlands. MCDD manage the money. So if we're going to do, and my bells rang when you said restoration efforts, that might be one of the ways that we can help assist with funding for the project. Because there's, I don't know how close you follow it, but DEQ has all the mitigation for people that want to do bad things. So they'd rather pay money to do the bad things. And they have a pot of money that they will allot for restoration, improvement, those kinds of things. So we might be able to explore that at some point, or somebody.
Yeah, and we have in other cases had some funding to do proactive restoration and active enhancement and net benefit to the environment using grant funds, like you mentioned, at the Children's Arboretum. We have some other funds that were from a mitigation pot of money. But as Jim was saying, I don't want to say, I mean, from the way that they're thinking about it, addressing the ongoing scour and addressing any new impacts are for them, us coming up to a baseline.
Right.
And addressing the negative consequences of the activities that we need to do to maintain our operations. But funding is much more often available for those times when you want to go above and beyond. But even then, they're quite careful that you're not then using that to address your baseline obligation to kind of keep the environment equally whole to when you started.
I understand that.
Okay.
But to Val's comment about adding soil and plantings would, I can see a case for enhancement there with Audubon, wildlife, birds, all those kinds of things. So anyway, I'll be quiet now.
I really appreciate the way you're thinking about it, Mary Helen. It's awesome. And we'd love to get more revenue from anybody we can. I think in this case, we're probably on our own, and maybe we can, we're always looking for opportunities to generate revenue to improve the environment in the watershed.
Thank you, Mary Helen. So Leslie, Kathy, is there anything you'd like to say before we move on in the agenda? I'm seeing shaking.
I guess I
heads.
really want to point out to the board that this is really a safety project. If we don't address that scour, we could see real trouble down the road with the levee, and the function of it as a flood protection measure could really be in jeopardy. So we're going to do everything we can to manage this really tightly and push our consultants up with the design that minimizes any additional mitigation costs that we have to pay for.
Yeah, I appreciate we need to do that. And in fact, it wasn't that long ago that we thought we were going to have to completely replace those pipes. So extending their life for another 10 years is still a less expensive alternative than we were facing a while ago. Okay.
And I do hope, Mary Helen, back to sort of your point, that over time, as we move into the new utility, that we can develop a different kind of programmatic relationship with these regulatory agencies, where operational projects like this are compensated by other good works under that watershed program that's called for in the legislation. So we'll see if we can't get that done, but that's down the road a while.
Okay, shall we move on to the next item on the agenda with Mark? You're going to discuss how we should be apportioning out the costs of the PED. Is that correct?
Yes. Thanks for that intro, Val. Does my sound okay? Okay, sounded a little bit weird there for a second. Okay, just going to share my screen and we can get started. Okay. Does everyone see that?
Not yet.
Not yet. I guess I have to push the share button. There we are. Can everyone see now? Great. Got a thumbs up. Okay. I'm not sure why it jumped ahead. Here we go. So today, Val, yes, we wanted to we had an opportunity to share with you more information about the funding and cost allocation methods last month at the format, but we heard that everyone wanted, and understandably wanted, an opportunity to discuss these things amongst their individual boards. So we wanted to revisit this topic. And we don't have a substantial amount of new information, just wanted to kind of review the old information. And so we have a couple of things to go through. I'm going to let you can see the agenda there. We're going to talk about, Jim has an intro, and then we're going to talk about the visit from the Army Corps. Major General Graham last week. We're going to review the information from our format, and then we're going to speak to the things that we heard from you in July and try to answer some of your questions. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jim. Jim, you're muted, unfortunately.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, board members. We did a quick chat about this conversation, and I know that costs are super important to your landowners, and you have an obligation as board members to do everything you can to minimize costs. And we're going to have a really good conversation about how we can move forward together. But I wanted to just remind you all why this matters, and it matters because we have the opportunity to get a 65% share of federal investment to modernize our system and prevent flooding. And this is just a couple of quick slides that demonstrate that it happens, and it happens right here in our backyard. And to get that 2/3 investment share back is such a great opportunity for us. Could we advance the slide again? So it happens here. And again, just reminding you of what things look like at Vanport when we didn't do it. And again, you can see a nice big ship going through a neighborhood here. This is 1996. And I think we have maybe one more slide, maybe not. Yes. And then this is just from this summer, right? I shared some links with you about really torrential rain events that are occurring candidly all over the world. These are just ones from Germany. Just this weekend, there were historic rain events in Washington, D.C. and in other places. So we're seeing changes in the climate that are creating huge risks for us. So one more slide. We're back to our, okay. So I know that costs are really important, but I want you to also think about your role as protecting the public and keeping people safe. We are in a situation where if we can come together and find a way to fund our local share, again, we're going to put in about 1/3 of the costs, and 2/3 are going to come from taxpayers across the nation. That's such a huge benefit to us. So I just wanted you to keep that in mind as we're talking about how we're going to divide the PED costs among the 4 districts and all the work that our team is doing to try and raise money externally to reduce those costs. Felt like it was really important to remind you why. Why are we having this conversation about allocation? It's really about keeping our system functional and keeping people safe. And with that, I'm going to go to the Colonel slide, and I'll just give you a happy news. We did have a tour with the local Colonel and Major General Graham from Washington, D.C. last week. And you can see the team here. We had a really awesome tour. We had a great lunch with the core team and the Colonel. And I guess what I will close with is we had a session after we got out on the road to see our system in person, scheduled for the General in case he had more questions. And we had folks from DC and all over on the line ready to go. And we pulled into our parking lot and we said, General, do you have any additional questions or concerns? We have the whole team ready for you. And he said, no, I have no additional questions. You guys are exactly the kind of partner we want to be working with. He was very impressed. So I think we have a reason for hope and optimism that money from the core is going to come through to provide that 2/3 return on our investment. I think it's really an important opportunity. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and hopefully that'll keep the opportunity to get this PED cost discussion going in the perspective that I think it really needs to be in as we think about the big picture and this amazing opportunity for federal investment in our area. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much,
And
Jim.
any comments or questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And sorry for the speech, but I just think it's really key for us to remember why we're really here.
Okay. See no questions. So I guess we'll dive into it, and we'll start off our discussion speaking to something we didn't go into as much detail about as allocation, and that's revenue options. And I think it's important to note that staff is looking into, we're kind of turning over all the rocks and looking into all available methods to fund PED, just so that you have the full range out on the table, and then we can advise you on the pros and cons from our perspective, and you can make a sound decision, keeping in mind that we don't need to make a decision currently. Obviously the decisions that we're trying to make will hopefully not take as much out of Hyde. The first option that we are looking into is a new state levy grant fund that could provide grants up to $2 million per biennium. So supposing that we could qualify each district separately for the $2 million, that would cover most of our costs for PED, and in many districts it will cover all of our costs for PED. So that's obviously one that we're looking very closely at. That won't be available potentially until April of 2023. Evan, is that correct? Thanks. And we'll take some questions right after this, since this is new material, but I'm going to run through these quickly. We've spoken before about assessments. Based on the current trends in increasing assessments over the last few years, the benchmark has been up to 10%. And so we've sort of looked at what is the possibility of funding PED using that method, and that is possible for 3 of the 4 districts. So that is another option. And then those are sort of obviously the most appealing and most attractive because they're not incurring further debt, and they're the least complicated. But given that those are possibly not appealing to everyone, nor is the levy grant fund a guaranteed possibility, we're also looking at the range of financing through public financing methods, through Business Oregon, or which may require backing from public partners. for in the same manner that the LRC IFA loans required partners backing. And then there are private loan options, and those are probably, you know, the least desirable, probably the most complicated. And but even if we do arrive at that point, we have to remind ourselves that interest rates are incredibly low right now, and the return on investment is incredibly high. So staff isn't particularly recommending anything in particular at this point in time. We're still sorting these things out, and we'll have more on these revenue options for you. But we kind of want to get you start thinking down the various roads, be able to ask questions about the various options, and we'll present more material soon. I also do want to point out that some boards do have some reserves that they could tap into and offset any of these other methods. And to that point, also it could be a hybrid methodology. So we could try for a grant, use some assessments, possibly use some reserves, or some public or private financing. It doesn't have to be one alternative. And I do also want to remind folks that the actual revenue demand each year will be for that year's cost of PED. So the numbers that you were presented with before, the total of 5.6 million was divided amongst the districts, and then it's further divided by year, so by the demand. So the Corps will release contracts for design, and all the money won't be required up front for each district. Kathy.
Yeah, thanks for this. I am curious what the assessment burden would be in financing. So paying back debt, whether it's public or private loan. I'm assuming it's far less than 10% per year to be able to repay that debt.
Make sure I'm capturing your question correctly. So yes, if we finance, it will not be, and there are different types of financing packages, and some have longer repayment terms. And so obviously, like any loan arrangement, there are different terms that you can agree upon, and it will be metered out at a much lesser amount than if you just take it out of hybrid assessments during the years that are the funds are requested from the Corps.
Mark, I'd also add there, Kathy, that we don't actually know yet that a private loan is feasible for your district, any combination of the districts. When MCDB sought the capital loan last year, it was very complicated, and it's very hard to try to get a bank to understand where we're going, and they don't consider the new district and that revenue structure real yet. And so, certainly we will continue to go down, continue to research this area, but we are not confident that it is totally feasible yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add in general, Evan?
Yeah, I think kind of just generally part of the reason that we put these up front and we're showing these to you all is to sort of help provide some context for the cost allocation discussion. Because for instance, if we were able to get the grants, it really takes the importance of that cost allocation discussion, it minimizes that to a certain extent. If we could get $2 million per district, then we could pay for PED sort of equally across the districts. So, we are working towards needing to make a decision and needing to sort of dot all the T's and cross all the T's and dot all the I's later this fiscal year. But right now we're sort of showing you the various options and putting this revenue piece on the table for context around the cost allocation discussion, because it could influence it a lot or impact it. Thanks, Mark.
Great. Thanks, Evan. We'll certainly have some more opportunity for discussion, but if I don't not seeing any more questions, I'm going to move on. This is basically a review of what we presented at the format last time, but simpler format. These are the leading methods, and we did hear loud and clear, you'll see them in a second, that you don't want to, you still want to see the reference methods. But these are the leading methods that staff had put forward. The ones based strictly on economic benefits and damages avoided, and then some composites that try to sort out various costs and try to find some more equities and balances between project costs and benefits received. These are the reference methods we discussed. As we discussed last time, some of these are traditional allocation methods, and some of them are cost-based, some of are benefits-based, and there was also, I think I want to just point out things like acreage is a simple surrogate for things like replacement value and eventually economic benefit, because obviously acreage speaks to one very simple metric, but there's a lot of analysis that goes into the others to show the benefits received. So so we're happy to continue the discussion about the pros and cons of these various methods. We're going to keep them all up for your reference. For example, here we haven't removed any of them. This is the full range of options that you requested we still show as we continue to talk about them. So with that little reminder, what we heard in July, we talked about, there's several questions that came up. I'm going to run through these briefly. There was a question that was brought up by one of the other boards that spoke to consideration for deferred maintenance. You know, some districts feel like they've put in their fair share and want to make sure or ask questions about how that was taken into account in the study or in any of the metrics that we presented. And I guess it's important to emphasize that the core study and the project portfolio that they came up with was selected based on needs of the system. And deferred maintenance is actually something that the Corps can't select projects for. So for instance, there are some projects that were specifically taken out of the initial range array of projects because the Corps considered them deferred maintenance. So none of the projects that are being funded are deferred maintenance. They were either existing problems. In some cases, they were, you know, if you will, sort of defective projects that were handed to us after previous Corps sponsorship. So for instance, the SDIC pump station was designed in a certain way that now we realized over many years of operating it, we realized that the elevations, they didn't quite get the elevations right. And so they're correcting that. In some cases, there were levees that had fragility concerns that they were handed to us by that. It was not a matter of deferred maintenance. So I won't dwell on that further, but hopefully that speaks a little bit to that issue. As I said before, we heard loud and clear that you wanted us to keep all the methodologies displayed so that you can see them and compare them. There was also concern about potentially setting a precedent by selecting one particular method now to fund PED. And I think that it's important to emphasize that whenever a method to allocate for PED is selected, we obviously can provide guidance, documentation, you can state your intent in selecting a particular method and why that may or may not be relevant for the future, so you can go on record. So staff doesn't believe that that this is necessarily setting a ground an immutable precedent. So we think that we should set an allocation method that is appropriate for PED. Okay. There was some questions about authorities and spending limits, spending limitations, and that spoke to That question was raised by SDIC, and we provided did some legal research with our in-house and outside counsel. And in short, and also feel free to let others step in if there's more questions on this. But in short, we did find that that the articles and clauses that define various districts, particularly in this case SDIC, stated that, and we're going to read it to make sure that I get it right, so that they require there's no clause that requires the works of the corporation to be within the boundary of the district. So it basically, the benefits have to be within the district. So so it's all based on benefits, again, benefits received. And so funds can be spent outside the districts if they benefit the districts. There was actually, in some cases, in some of our districts, we know that the district boundaries don't correlate exactly with our levy boundaries. And so in some cases, they would actually be problematic if we interpreted some of these things too strictly. And so we have some documentation for anyone that is interested in learning more, but we found that funds can be spent outside the districts as long as the benefits received are within the districts in the system. Is there anything else, Jim? I think you spoke to this question offline.
Unless there's questions, I think I can leave it at that.
Okay.
But I'd be happy to answer questions, or Kelly, I'm sure, could help.
Okay, just want to make sure I represented that well. And then some other topics we heard about. I think we realized we didn't have the time. I think we possibly needed more information about what was requested specifically. There were some questions that asked about how the economic benefits were gathered and calculated. We can certainly speak to that in nauseous detail, or we can provide a brief summary. Certainly happy to do either. I guess if some more feedback would be necessary to gauge interest in getting more information on that. Obviously, as we point out regularly, the economic benefits appendix of the study, and even just the economic section of the main report are quite lengthy and a little bit not fit for quick consumption. So we're happy to distill or break that down for you, but trying to gauge actual interest. The same thing applies to the life loss modeling. I think it's very interesting, and it's very important to understand that life loss modeling was a very big part of the study, and the Corps actually is moving away from strictly looking at economic analysis for approval of studies and for prioritization and ranking for authorization and funding. And so I think we talk so much about economic benefits that life loss modeling and that part of the decision making isn't discussed. So we're happy to do a segment on it, or do like an offline chat, or some kind of presentation to get you that information and distill it a little bit more. But looking for feedback on that. Kathy.
Yeah, I wasn't actually at the July meeting, but I mean, I am interested in both of these. I think from my perspective, taking sort of if you had to write a 2-page memo to an elected official about what the economic benefits study included, its assumptions, really high level methodology, what's in it, what's not in it, kind of thing, and then the meaning of the results. Similarly for the life loss modeling, I think coming at it from that high level would be incredibly helpful. And then for those of us that want to dig deeper, we could. I believe you did the economic study with Eco Northwest. Is that right? No?
We actually used some of the economic data that Levy Ready Columbia had generated for us as some of our reference information. But the actual economic analysis was done by the Corps' economist, and they used some standard methodology. There's a standard HEC FDA model, which is a flood damage analysis model, and it sort of it brings the failure models, the geotechnical failure modeling and the hydraulic modeling all into play, and then it uses building inventory and other information to produce these numbers. And they did a pretty exhaustive job, but yeah, so it built on some of the work that FCS had done previously, and then they did quite a bit of work on their own.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, what you just described, that's a good start to better understanding it. I have no doubt that was exhaustive and rigorous. I also assume if it's a standard core methodology that it's extremely narrowly defined with some very over rationalized assumptions about how the world works. And so it would be interesting and helpful to hear a little bit more about that.
Okay, well, that's good feedback. We could certainly start with some sort of primers on the subject matter and see where that leaves us. I will say one thing that came up during the general's visit, just to make, I don't ever want to pretend that the Corps does anything doesn't do the most cutting edge thing, maybe by normal standards, but in this case, I think they actually did a pretty fair job of going above and beyond. And we'll explain more of that in the memos, but we actually did some, they surprised staff by going and having sort of interviews with emergency managers and those sorts of things to inform the life loss modeling. So there's a lot of assumptions still baked in for sure, but we were pretty impressed. And the previous work that Levy Ready Columbia did in terms of technical research and like borings, some of the geotechnical data actually freed the Corps up to do more of this stuff. So they didn't use as much of their budget on the basic survey and sampling, and that allowed them to do more of this work. But we'll tell you more about it in some memos.
Oh, also, and I just used the memo as an example. I didn't mean to say, please write me a memo.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Understood.
I have a couple questions, and they're probably, the 101 part of it. When I looked at these, I tried to view them through the eyes of when we try to explain this to our neighbors. One is the use of all the acronyms, and I say this all the time, but even I have to stop and think what PMLS is, what PED means. And so when we get to that point, but I also go back to, with all these methodologies and looking at the numbers, part of the decision is going to be who has the money. Penn 1 doesn't have any money, but they get 40% of the cost. So how are those allocations or funding issues going to be addressed? It's still back to people telling me, why are we paying for something in Sandy? Or the Sandy people saying, why are we paying something in Portland when we don't get any of the economic benefit, kind of thing. 7% compared to MCDD that gets 58% of the economic benefit. I know that's because of Expo and the airport and the industrial areas, Columbia Corridor. But somehow I would like to find the rationalization of experts like all of you. How do you best explain to what I have heard interpreted so far amongst some board members, even going back to Levy Ready Columbia, why are we paying for something when, and I know Penn 1 is primarily city property or a great number, without making the people that get the most benefit and have the most cost, because they don't have reserves, we're paying for them. And so that question to the general public who's not knee deep in this, like and I'm not knee deep, I'm probably toe deep. But you'd be hard pressed to even tell people what US, the acronym for US Army Corps of Engineers and what they do. They hear that name and they say, oh, they're going to build a wall in Bridgeton and we won't be able to get to our houses. So we need to be able to counter those things that we've already heard through visits. And I think the Army Corps of Engineers did a great job with meeting 3 or 4 times with Bridgeton and Marine Drive people. But I think we need to look at it from that standpoint. How are we going to answer what we know we're already going to get confronted with? And these figures, to me, if I handed this to a couple of the neighbors that kind of pay attention, they'd go off the wall. I mean, so I, as a board supervisor, I appreciate all the numbers and all the percentages, but this is not gonna help me convince people that they should help fund this project or that this is a worthwhile project. I mean, we've already said we want to do it and we're responsible for that, but as a board supervisor, I want to be able to say people why it's such a good thing.
Mary Helen, I think that the easier, I mean, we will need to keep working on this, obviously, but you don't need to go into this level of detail with your neighbors. What you need to be able to talk about with your neighbors is the Corps is talking about giving us $130 million at a return of investment of whatever that math is. You know, this is about us getting money from the feds to improve and strengthen our levee system at a rate that is significantly lower than if we have to pay for it completely on our own. And that is the main narrative here. I know that we have issues in Penn 2 and that there are residents who do not believe that the system is at risk or that they're, you know, that's an issue that we're going to have to keep working on and keep educating folks on. But that's the main message here. If somebody really wants to get into the details of cost allocation and how the 4 districts are paying for it, who's paying for what, you know, staff is always happy to sit down with them and walk through the every detail down to the, you know, minutia. But I don't think it's your responsibility to be able to explain this stuff, nor do I think most people want to get to this level of detail. What they want to know is, why is this good for me? How is it going to benefit me and my property? How are we paying for it generally? And what's it going to cost? What's it actually going to end up costing me in my pocketbook? And I think what we're trying to help you all understand is this is a pathway to significantly less money than if we had to figure out how to do it by ourselves. And at the end of the day, we run a system. Do we, you know, 5 years from now when we're running a geo bond, and I mean, I'm just imagining what could be possible, but 5 years from now, if we're running a geo bond to pay for the construction of all of this, we're going to be one system. We're going to be one district. And there's going to be, you know, a lot less consideration of the, you know, who is paying for what and where. Obviously, we need to deal with that over the next several years and work through it for PED. But, you know, at some point, we do need to start moving our community towards an understanding that this is one system. And if Penn 1 floods, you guys in Penn 2 are, we know, we've seen cascading failures happen in this system. If Penn 1 floods, if the railroad embankment breaches, you guys are at risk. And the worst part is the poor people right behind the cross levee at Fox Run and other places are the most at risk. And so, you know, those are the things that we need to be talking to our community about, not let's dig into percentages of cost allocations. Unfortunately, that's your job as decision makers to be our leaders and to make those choices. So I hope that helps, Jim. I'm sure you have lots of good stuff to add.
Yeah, no.
I mean, I think you're on track, and I appreciate your challenge right now. I don't envy you being a board member trying to figure this out, but I do think stepping up to that higher level of flood safety, it's why I started the conversation with those slides and to help you remember the cascading failures we've seen in the past. And the fact that we're going to get a 66% return on our investment locally. You don't get that from a bank. You don't get that from stocks. It's would be more expensive for the landowners in Penn 2 if they did it alone. And if they want to bear the flood risk, then you guys as a board, I guess, have a chance to pull out. But I think that would be foolish. So I don't mean to be so draconian, but we can help you with this. We also hope, again, sometime this fall or winter, early winter, to get some public opinion research that will help us hone these messages and identify which types of communities are most interested in different types of argument about this. And again, we're going to get that done. It's going to be a little while.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And kind of to your point, and not to dogpile, because I think it's about time to turn it over to Jamie, but I do just want to put my nerd hat on and just remind you the why we're here in Penn 2, the projects that will be paid for. You know, I think it's to be honest, there in MCDD, I think we have a little more convincing to help them understand. You know, they could look at it on paper and say, we have this percentage of projects costs, but we have like this amount of benefits. How do they come to terms with that? In Penn 2, we have a system that is low. It is not receiving the same level of protection. In the next 50 years, we've seen our weather patterns change, and we've seen more and more concern with that. So if I was living in Penn 2, I would certainly, it wouldn't be hard to argue that we would appreciate that extra level of protection. There are low spots. There is a cross levee that is nobody really thinks about it because it hasn't been historic. But if MCDD breached, it could breach back into Penn 2 coming the other way. So there's a lot of different scenarios in there. And then finally, so we've got overtopping, we've got prior to overtopping breaches. And then lastly, there are pump station improvements that will benefit you. And we've seen those this year. We've seen localized flooding concerns. Ultimately, all that water ends up at a pump station. And the Corps study doesn't just project against overtopping and breaches prior to overtopping, but also internal drainage. So you have a 500-year storm like we had in Germany, and that inundates the whole system and it can't get out quickly enough. Our improvements are going to increase the capacity at, say, 13th Avenue pump station. So just wanted to remind you all that these are the actual on the ground projects that are being sponsored, would be sponsored.
No, I just want to say thank you for all that. It's just, I see my role more changing the mindset of contact MCD, getting you guys more involved in conversation, because I'm going to say 5 years ago, you'd say MCDD and people would say, what was that? And so now the focus, because of the discussions, and I think that's more important, my role, than try to explain things, because otherwise people make things up. And so I appreciate all that. I also appreciate the talking points that Evan sent us if we run into elected officials that ask us questions. I carried them with me. I mean, had them with me in a Zoom meeting the other day, and somebody said, how's that project in the building up the levee going? And so I was like, ripped out my little piece of paper. So it really helps. I mean, and so I think our discussions are more to, like Evan said, convince people this is a really good thing, and they're getting benefits beyond what they believe. The good news is, and I use this, is you've been dry for 100 and whatever years, and now we're going to get even better at that. So I appreciate that. I just want to kind of keep our minds, and not to pick on you, Mark, but in the nerdy sense, but just in the sense of what a person walking down the street, you know, if you didn't do this, you're going to pay a whole lot of money in flood insurance. I mean, that's not the, but it's kind of what would happen. I mean, so, okay, I'll be quiet.
We haven't been dry. I think that's a really important point to remember in all of this. We haven't been dry. We've had floods that overcame our system.
But they've been managed. I mean, you know, well, other than Vanport, but I'm not going back that far in this discussion anyway.
No, thank you for always reminding us about the public perception on all of this. And I think consistently having you remind us helps us do a better job of reminding you all, you know, we're taking you down really far into the weeds so that you can make informed decisions But we certainly don't expect you to be able to explain all of this in infinite detail to your landowners, and we can help if it comes to that.
I'll just offer, happy to have a cup of coffee with you and anybody that you need to have a conversation with. And we want to have your back, and you guys have hard jobs.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, we put this slide in here for further discussion, but we've been having the discussion. So I'm not, and I'm mindful of the other agenda items, but I just want to remind everybody that in July, we brought forward that kind of year-long look of all the different topics that we would be bringing forward. And so the intent of bringing this forward isn't to get, wrapped around the axle. It's more to continue to raise your comfort level with where we're going with these topics, to keep them fresh in your mind. We're going to be talking about these every month, and different topics we'll be bringing in front of you so that you can get more familiar, with these different decisions that you're going to be making eventually, and more comfortable with the content and talking with your constituents about these items. So that's really the point of it, is the more we sit with it and the more we talk about it, the more you get to kind of poke around it, the better we'll all get at explaining, what we're doing and where we are. But, is there another question? We've heard a lot from Mary Helen. We've heard from Kathy. Val?
Yes, in the sent out materials, there was a question, can we eliminate any of the options? And personally, I feel very strongly that economic benefit needs to be in the calculation. So for me, you could eliminate any of the allocation methods that do not include economic benefit. I don't know if we want to actually do this at this point. The only exception to that would be if we could get grants in the future, then it's really necessary to spread it out such that if the whole cost is covered. That would be the only exception to my position or my attitude, that really ought to include economic benefit. Now, of course, I was struck by that analysis that indicated that 43% of the PED is what I would call overhead. I'm struck by that. It was a nasty blow, actually. And I found it persuasive, but on the other hand, part of that reason I found it persuasive was because it would reduce PED 2's allocation, and that would not escape the observation of the other districts, I'm sure. But maybe we need to consider a combination of, well, actually 2 and 3 aren't consistently used in the thing, but an allocation where half of it, say, is economic benefit, and the other half is split between project cost and equal, or equal as the 43% of it equal anyway. Anyway, those are the thoughts I had about it. I do see that there are non-economic benefits that accrue heavily to PEN 2 because we've got more people, and therefore more people's psychological well-being is benefited within PEN 2 because we have a lot of people. But those are my thoughts currently.
Val, Mark had to sort of describe in detail to me what that overhead is that you're calling it, because I initially had a similar reaction that you had, but given that we're in the design phase and it is predominantly a administrative function, not a digging dirt in a specific district, he sort of helped me understand what some of those costs are that we're all going to be sharing across the districts. So if that's of benefit, I think might be a good thing to kind of, it sounds like you're okay with it, but just something to have a little bit more information about.
I think I've said my piece.
Yeah.
Any other supervisor have any comments they wish to make or questions? Is the horse dead? Have we beaten it to death now?
No, I think I also just want to make sure that I can stop taking notes on the screen if it's distracting. It seems to.
We're not seeing it, Mark. It's okay.
You're not seeing it.
I asked to go back to seeing everybody's faces, but if you want to have the
Great.
notes on the screen, we can capture it. Sorry about that.
I'm good with you guys. Not seeing my messy work here, but we'll be happy to share what comes out of this meeting in terms of notes. Maybe it's better that way.
Well, and Mr. Chair, I would just say if only the horse were dead, it would be awesome. But I think we have a lot more writing to do before we're going to get to some decisions. But I think that's important too, just given all this commentary. We have a lot of explaining and a lot of conversation to have yet.
Yeah.
And
we will
hopefully
keep
we're going to be
these topics-
successful raising some external money, and that'll reduce the costs.
Yeah, so I think Mark and Evan, that's everything that we had. I mean, we'll see you at subsequent meetings with more on this topic and additional topics. And so thanks for your input. Mark, anything else?
No, just want to stress that if other questions occur to you offline, feel free to send them our way so that we can be prepared and answer them for you the next time we meet, and just keep refining these your understanding of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mark.
Your feedback's very helpful, you guys.
I guess on the agenda now, Mr. Minna, you have the
Thank
floor.
you. I appreciate that, Mr. Chair. I have three things I want to talk to you about. The first is Department of State lands matter that I want you to be aware of. You all may recall that we did an emergency repair to a levee in the Bridgeton neighborhood. I don't know whether there's anybody on the line who can remember what year that was. I think it was 2017. And we believed at the time that we had authorization from the Corps and everyone we needed to do that emergency repair. I want to stress that all of our engineers and the agencies agreed that it was an emergency and we needed to fix it. So we did fix it, and we learned after the fact fairly recently that the Department of State Lands felt like we didn't get appropriate approvals for that emergency repair. So we've been in discussions with them, and they have decided that they are going to levy a $5,000 fee to us for our mistake in not completing the permit process. That mistake is on MCDD staff. And so we've talked to the MCDD board, and they're going to cover that $5,000 expense. But as we talked about earlier in the discharge pipe thing, when you do an emergency repair, often you have to go back in later and do the repair correctly or make it put the bioengineering in and so on. So we are in the process of getting permitted to do that. And those are costs that Penn 2 would have had to bear anyway, because we would have needed to go in and do the repair right. We are close to final designs and completing permitting on that project. And I hope we're going to be in water doing that construction during the next in-water work window. Do I have that right, team? Carrie?
Well, I think we actually hope we're doing it maybe even later so that we can work when the water is lowest. So the timing is still up in the air in order to minimize impacts to water quality and make sure that we can do the work safely. And yeah, while the water is.
Sorry about the timing issue. So I guess what you need to know is, I think what we did is we bought you time for a couple of years before you needed to go back in and do that more complete repair project. And we're going to cover at MCDD any additional expenses associated with the negotiations with the Department of State Lands. So we're moving ahead with that project. I'm happy to answer any additional questions if you have any, but we're going to make that right. And we're going to put a bioengineered solution. It'll look more consistent with the rest of the bank. And I think the neighbors will like it. It's something you would have to do anyway, eventually.
Leslie, chime in. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think that part of the bank looks that different from anywhere else near it. But
yeah, there was some complaints about the vegetation not being consistent. So we'll have a better vegetation. It's not a very pretty bank to begin with, but it'll be better.
No. And the vegetations vary the whole distance. It's, yeah. I understand. But.
My only concern, and I'll go back to let the neighbors know so that they don't make things up. They have an active land use chair. I mean, Eric Molander, Marty Slapikas, Tom Hickey, those people will be, and Leslie, correct me if I'm wrong, they will be extremely interested in what's going to go on. And there's a couple other neighbors in the neighborhood that raised a lot of resistance in the last work. And I'm going to go back, clear back to, they still cling to the memories of when you, I'm going to say you, MCD cut trees down on the levee.
Yep.
I sat in a meeting there that I'm not going to say feared for my life, but it was close. So I would encourage you to keep them informed ahead of time before you go out and put the rocks or whatever you're going to do.
Thank you, Mary Helen. That's really good advice. And we may need to reach out to you as we move nearer to construction to get your best thinking on the folks we should talk with.
Well, Tom is moving away from the area, unfortunately. So someone who actually lives in a floating home pretty much right below where that work was done is going to be taking over as the chair in the neighborhood, Bridget. But Eric's the one that is the land use chair and very involved. And he's also on part of MCD boards. So he's become involved with the whole levee system.
All right, team, let's remember to reach out to Eric and give him an update on this project. Mr. Chair, it looks like you have your hand up. I don't mean to facilitate on your behalf.
Yes, there is an item of, my memory says that there was a question when that slough occurred as to whether we in fact were even responsible for repairing it, because it apparently does not impact the actual section of the levee, that it was overbuilt, built without any particular oversight by people who lived there who wanted parking. And they just brought in stuff and dumped it and created that overbuild, which then subsequently sloughed. So it seems to me that our taking over the responsibility for fixing it was in some sense an unrequired benefit to those folks. And maybe they should be a little bit more grateful that they're not stuck fixing it themselves.
Well, gratitude is always welcome. When I first learned about this potential consent order and so on from DSL, I did talk independently with our two key geotech and our chief engineer, Bill Owens and Kevin, and just said, was this thing really an emergency? Was it really at risk? And both of them independently, not knowing I was talking to either of them, said, yes, it was a big deal. It was a failure that we were really concerned about given the sheer strength of the flow that was happening at that time. So they both believed it was an emergency that required repair. I'd be happy to have them reach out to you, Mr. Chair, if you'd like to hear that. I don't know whether that's true, but that really, to me, made me feel confident that the fact that we had acted in that emergency situation made sense, despite the fact we didn't dot all of our I's and cross all of our T's in that case.
I think I'm comfortable with the fact that we were worried that eventually our cross section would be endangered. It's just that my understanding is that it was not initially.
Yeah.
And part of the reason of the failure was it was not built according to our standards.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that point. Something maybe we can try and remind them about if we have some conversations with them.
Unfortunately, the people who are having the issues don't even live in that section. They live a ways back. They just are interested in everything going on.
Well, I guess I'll close on this matter by saying thanks to Kevin and Carrie and other members of the team who weren't present when that initial work happened, who have really just done a great job coming up with a cost-effective plan and really trying to repair some relationships with our regulatory partners so that in the future, we'll have a more thoughtful and collaborative relationship with them. So thanks to Carrie and Kevin and the team for stepping in on this one and really trying to do a good job with it. Thank you, guys. Okay, I have two other items, and I think I'm probably standing between you and lunch, so I'll try and be brief, but I also want to give you a heads up on a couple things that are going to be coming your way in September. The first one is I'm working with our team. MCDD has adopted an equity policy, and for those of you who participated in the selection process for my job, equity was a big part of the job announcement and so on, so I'm taking it very seriously. And so we've reviewed the MCDD equity policy, and I'm working with staff now to revise it. And I'm going to bring it proposal to you in September for you guys to consider adopting a consistent equity policy. It will be a little bit different because you don't have staff, but it will really try and hit the values that I think all of the districts share. And so that draft will be coming to you well before your meeting. We'll have a conversation about it in September, and we can decide whether to move forward. My goal is to present it to each of the other districts in September, and then at a format meeting, ideally, if you have no concerns or improvements you want us to make, that you would consider adopting it at the format meeting. Again, more to come on that. It's really more a statement of values, but I think it's important for us to be consistent across all the districts so that staff is clear that equity is a priority for our organization. The other one that has some fairly important implications is on houselessness. And so I'm working with legal and engineering and a bunch of folks in our organization to prepare some resolutions for your consideration. And what they will essentially do is really restate our authorities as we understand them to restrict the time, place, and manner of uses of the property that we own, and potentially some of the areas where we have easements. And what that would mean for us is we will be able to sign all of our areas that camping is not allowed, and you will give us the authority to do a little bit more proactive work, to do outreach for the campers, to work a little bit more assertively with the Port of Portland and other partners to assert our rights to have good access and to protect our system of flood safety. After we get those policies done, if you agree with them, we're going to engage in a fairly significant signage process. So we'll have a lot more signage up that will help be clear for people that these are not places that are appropriate for camping or other activities that block access to our pump stations or cause harm to the levees. And then in addition to that, so that policy will be coming to all the boards in September. I'm hopeful. Again, we have to work through all the legal authorities and so on. But at the end of the day, we need to step up our game because the Corps and others are concerned about the condition of the levees, and we have trouble accessing some of our facilities. On the good news side, we did do a cleanup at Schmear Road recently. And I want to give Bill and Randy, the ops team, a bunch of kudos because they coordinated a whole bunch of folks to get out there. We did great outreach. We worked with a tow truck operator. We worked with Cascadia Behavioral Health and Rapid Response BioClean. I think we're close. There was one big hulking vehicle that we didn't have the right equipment to take out of there, but I know we're close to getting that done. We put up new fencing, put up some Jersey barriers, and we're going to try and maintain that site. So more to come on that. We're also looking to negotiate with Metro to see if we can get an IGA going with them for illegal dumping cleanup. We are looking at expanding our contracts with Cascadia Behavioral Health and Rapid Response BioClean. And we're also looking into some options to provide security at a few sites for our ops team who has some safety concerns. And finally, we are working to develop a broader assortment of towing companies that can help us remove illegally parked vehicles that are causing damage or blocking access. Now, I want you to know that we're working really closely with the Port and the City of Portland and City of Gresham and all of our partners who are all in a similar state, trying to figure out how do we best address this situation with compassion. Nobody wants to be living outside. At the same time, we have critical flood infrastructure that we need to access and maintain. So just on the phone with City Commissioner Dan Ryan's office yesterday, with Multnomah County, really trying to pull together a team to figure out how we're going to move forward on this. But the thing you need to know is you'll be considering some resolutions to document our authority to access and maintain our system, probably in September. Kelly, do you want to add anything to that since you're, I think, following it and since Hong's on break this week?
No, I think that sounded like a great synopsis. Thanks, Jim.
Okay. And really, that's it from me. I want to just reiterate how great it was to have the Major General out here and how excited our team is about the enthusiasm the Corps is bringing to providing that 66% share of the costs of this modernization program. It was really fun to meet the Colonel, and who's local, and the Major General and the team for me. And again, we're really fortunate to have them as strong partners. And I'm happy to answer any other questions that you all have, and appreciate your time and service.
I just want to say thank you for your work on the houselessness, because I've been following that for 4 or 5 years. I'll get in contact with you about conversations that Bill and I have had with Amazon and their interest in assisting, because that affects them all along that levee. And so,
Yeah.
But
And I
thank
wanna
you
just
because
shout-
it did.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'm clicking. Yeah, I'm between everybody and lunch. But you've done great work, advanced it, and the coordination with has always been an issue. And I think that's wonderful that you've been able to bring all those people together, because probably till this point not. So
Just a couple, Bill Owen really deserves a lot of shout out because he's done a lot of the work planning. And if you happen to bump into Randy, our operations manager, or any of the operations team out in the field, if you'd please say thank you to them too. They're really on the front lines and having to witness some of the just really untenable circumstances people find themselves in, and it's very stressful for them. So again, if you do happen to see them out in the field, if you would say thank you to them, that would be very meaningful, I know.
Thank you, and I do want to add my thank you to you for your aggressive, maybe aggressive is the wrong word, your energetic attention to this houseless problem. That's I did see some of the cleanup happening along Schmear Road as I came along one day, and it's good to see somebody taking care of it. You
Great,
should know
thank you.
about Terrence Moses, a private individual who goes around picking up garbage from people, and he recently ran a GoFundMe page to get some assistance in cleaning up at I-5 and Rosa Parks and Lombard, and I believe also in our area. So that's another person that you might find benefit coordinating with. He's private. He's been doing this for years, and he's a major contributor to our neighborhood's livability.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Will you say his name again?
Terrence Moses.
Do you have contact information?
Jim, I've got it. We've been in touch with him before.
Great. Thank you for
Thank
the
you.
suggestion, Mr. Chair.
If is there any new business? It looks
this is
like
way
we-
off the radar, but I'm just curious about this because I just got an email flash alert, important thing from next door. And so I looked at that. They said that there was a fire in the ditch on MLK and Gertz Road. I don't know how anybody gets that information. So just an FYI. And mind you, it's next door. So
I guess I should probably tell you one more thing, and Nick can jump in too. We are about to finalize our contract with Echo Northwest consulting firm to start work on developing the rate structure for the new utility. And I know some of you cross over to the urban board and so on, but we will do our best along the way. That work's just commencing, but we want to give you regular updates on that because I know you're really interested in all of the cost issues. And so we'll do our best to keep you informed, and that work's going to kick off early next month.
You raised an excellent point, Jim. I hadn't thought of that. Should we schedule routine small updates to all of the district boards on the Equinox?
Yeah, I think we should, or I could do it as part of my regular update.
Okay.
And the other
Either way.
innovation, it's not really an innovation, but Nick and I are working on bringing you more regular financial updates. So you should start getting something at least quarterly where you can see just a statement of accounts and budget to actual and so on. We're going to have some draft products for review by the board soon, but I felt like it was interesting that we weren't doing that, and I need it and I want to see it, and I suspect you all might enjoy seeing it too. So you can look forward to that in the next month or so.
Okay. No further questions, comments, or new business. Then this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you again for your service. You all really appreciate you.
thank you for all your support.